Today we're returning to Nelson Lakes National Park, to an understandably popular circuit and some of the clearest freshwater in the world. Let's talk about the Travers-Sabine Circuit and Blue Lake. Kia ora and welcome to the Tramping Life, a podcast about hiking in Aotearoa, New Zealand, or as we call it here, tramping. I'm Chauncey, and in this episode I'll talk about a specific track or hut. I'll give an overview and share my experience, along with the highlights and some practical advice. The Travers-Sabine Circuit is one of New Zealand's classic multi-day tramping routes, lying deep in Nelson Lakes National Park in the Upper South Island. It's a circa 80-kilometre loop that typically takes 4 to 7 days to complete, weaving through beech forest, open tussock, river valleys and alpine passes, including the high point of Travers Saddle, 1,787 metres above sea level. Trampers usually start from St Arnaud, a tranquil community on the shores of Lake Rotoiti, and either walk 3 hours to Lakehead hut or cold water hut, or catch a water taxi. From here, head up the Travers Valley for 4.5 hours to Tait hut. Further up the valley lies Upper Travers hut at the base of the east face of Mount Travers. From here is a 450-metre climb to the Travers Saddle, followed by a knee-destroying steep 1,000-kilometre descent to the Sabine River and West Sabine hut, nestled in the bush across the river. From West Sabine hut, it's a 7-hour return hike up a surprisingly steep valley to Blue Lake hut. This lies close to Blue Lake, one of the clearest natural freshwater lakes in the world. Please stay out of the lake and avoid putting anything into the lake to avoid contaminating this natural wonder. Thanks to Instagram and Te Araroa, this is now a popular place to visit, despite taking several days of decent hiking to reach. Returning back to the circuit from West Sabine hut, it's a seemingly endless 5-hour slog by the Sabine River to the attractively situated Sabine hut on the shores of Lake Rotomairewhenua. From here, the circuit continues to Speargrass hut and then on to Mount Robert car park. The Travers-Sabine Circuit is basically a loop hike around Angelus Hut with 5 different routes to reach the hut of the main circuit, which I've covered in a previous episode of The Tramping Life. A less well-known but scenic detour is a 5-hour hike from Sabine Hut up to the 3-bunk Mount Misery Hut. This offers great views of Lake Rotomairewhenua and is a memorable place to stay. Mount Misery Hut doesn't need to be booked. I walked the Travers-Sabine Circuit for the first time a decade ago. It was my 13th multi-day hike, with appropriate luck, unfortunately. I broke a hiking pole, had torrential rain, dodgy river crossings, thunder, lightning and hail, and I hurt myself in all the wrong places for hiking, i.e. my knee, wrist and palm, even before I'd started the track. Thankfully, it was balanced out with some good luck. The weather cleared whilst crossing the Travers Saddle. I saw blue ducks. The sun came out over Lake Angelus and whilst walking along Robert Bridge, and I had a 24-bunk hut to myself, literally hours away from another human being. At that stage, it was probably the most alone I've been in my life. Over 5 days, I walked the Travers-Sabine Circuit via Angelus Hut with a side trip out to Blue Lake and back. A few days before, I'd removed most of the skin from my right knee and left wrist in an accident whilst running to catch a train. My flight to Nelson was delayed by an hour and the forecast was for heavy rain for the next 2 days. It was overcast but thankfully dry by the time I arrived at St Arnaud's famous jetty on Lake Rotoiti, under which enormous eels lurked. I made up for lost time from the delayed flight by taking a water taxi over to Lakehead hut, skipping around 10 kilometres, as I still had 21k to go before reaching my home for the night. It took me a couple of hours to adjust to being on the track. It was quite surreal going from my bed at home in Auckland that morning to by lunchtime walking along yellow grass-filled valleys surrounded by mountains. After 3.5 hours, I reached the empty Tait hut. I was pretty wet by that point, but soon after reached complete saturation with a tough 3 hours left at Upper Travers hut. I got there by 6:45 p.m. to find it deserted. This was unexpected and the first time I had a hut to myself. It was pretty eerie as darkness closed in and the rain got heavier and it continued all night. It sounded like there was a river running right by the hut. I discovered in the morning that this actually was the case, with the track now a stream. My legs felt like they'd been in a fight and lost. Not the ideal preparation for what was going to be a far tougher day than yesterday, ascending 450 metres over the near 1,800 metre high Travers Saddle, and then descending steeply over 1,000 metres down to West Sabine hut, with a further 8k uphill to Blue Lake hut. Given the continued rain, I was tempted to wait it out in the hut, but the forecast was for the rain to lift, so I got going up the saddle. And I'm glad I did, as after an hour and a half I reached the highest point, the skies cleared, and I was rewarded with some quite spectacular views. After a steep descent down into the valley, all was going well until I came across a flooded stream which didn't look very passable to me. I had a good look up and down for an easier place to cross, but there was simply too much water coming off the mountains after the heavy rainfall. This was my first experience with a flooded river. It wasn't wide, but it did seem deep and fast and led into the main river below. I took a photo and waited 2 hours. Comparing photos, it clearly dropped significantly, so I went for it. I got very wet boots, but 20 seconds later, I'd crossed the stream. This put the time pressure on, though. I got to West Sabine Hut by 5 p.m, and I was tempted to stay, but I was even keener to make it to Blue Lake Hut. I had a couple of hours of daylight left, which wasn't quite enough. I made it to a near-full Blue Lake Hut in darkness by 8 p.m. and promptly collapsed on a bunk and started to shiver from exhaustion. These are my early days of tramping. You learn from experience. Thankfully, I felt much better in the morning, despite being woken by what sounded like a small jet engine, which turned out to be a jet oil. I spent less than half an hour at Blue Lake Hut, appropriately seeing a pair of blue ducks on top, with the lake bottom visible tens of metres below, quite a surreal sight. It was just about worth the tough 5 hour and 16k walk detour from West Sabine Hut. In retrospect, it was a bad call, but I decided not to have an early lunch at West Sabine Hut, as it was only 10:30, and instead continued on to Sabine Hut, 15.5 kilometres and 5 hours away. I learnt the hard way that attempting 23 kilometres in one go without more than a couple of minutes break for water or a muesli bar wasn't a great idea. Early on, I slipped on a rock, with my hiking pole taking the damage. I gained a slight bend, which got worse as I continued until it basically fell apart, which is basically how I felt as I got slower towards the never-appearing hut. My legs were fine, but my hips and shoulders were really suffering from the weight of the pack. It was such a relief to finally reach the hut on the idyllic shores of Lake Rotomairewhenua, approached in daylight for once. The next day, I took the Mount Cedric route to Angelus Hut, which I've talked about before, to finish the circuit. Some of the highlights: the views from Travers Saddle are epic, with peaks all around and valleys dropping away on either side. Blue Lake is a bit of a mission to reach, but it is a unique and special place. The circuit is a good challenge, a significant step up from great walks, but navigation is straightforward and there are plenty of huts to break up the trip. And there's plenty of landscape variety, with the landscape changing from forested shores of Lake Rotoiti to river flats, alpine tussock, beech woodland and high ridge lines, a real cross-section of Nelson Lake's terrain. To finish with some practical advice, book the huts in advance. All the main huts on the circuit, other than Coldwater Hut, need to be booked, and some like Blue Lake Hut on the Tait route and can get very busy during that season. The best time for the full circuit and side trips like Blue Lake is between October and May, when snow is less likely and passes are safer. Alpine sections require advanced skills, equipment and avalanche awareness. Any time of year, be prepared for rapid weather changes on and around the saddle. The Mountain Safety Council have a short video about the Travers Saddle on their website, which is worth watching. Wasps are increasingly a problem in Nelson Lakes, though they are usually under control along the track. New Zealand has some of the highest densities of wasps in the world, with up to 12,000 nests per hectare. They're particularly active in late summer and autumn. They feed on honeydew, which is produced by a native scale insect, and is an important food source for native birds, bats, insects, and lizards. The sandflies on the circuit can be pretty bad, particularly at Sabine, Lakehead, and Coldwater Huts by lakes. After heavy rain, some rivers and unbridged crossings can become tricky and require waiting or careful negotiation. Finally, the Blue Lake side trip is steep, and whilst rewarding, it is a decent detour to add onto an already relatively challenging circuit, so consider your fitness levels and abilities. Thank you so much for listening to The Tramping Life. If you've enjoyed today's episode, please follow the podcast in whatever app you use, tell a friend about it, and consider leaving a rating or a review. It really helps more people discover the show. If you have any questions or feedback, I'd love to hear from you. Drop me an email at thetrampinglife, one word, @gmail.com.